Hello and welcome back to this Downplay Dualistic Crusade. In this video I'm going to be reviewing the Kino Lorber Blu-ray release that is sadly out of print but still available from some sellers of the immortal 1939 Republic 12-chapter cliffhanger serial Daredevils of the Red Circle from the legendary directing team of William Witney and John English, the unquestionable kings of the cliffhanger adventure serial. When they were paired together, since serials were oftentimes directed by a directing team, simply because the workload was so massive for a chapter serial. Usually one director would focus more on the action and the other more on the dialogue scenes. But there are several great directing teams for the serials, but the Witney-English serials at Republic, who became very much the best known of studios for producing the best cliffhanger serials of different genres. When you look at the serials, you recognize there's a certain level of quality across the board that is really unequaled, and that quality is found entirely in the William Witney, John English serials. They are all just sheer magic, really, and the best of them represent the real pinnacle of the serial. So Daredevils of the Red Circle is right there in the middle of this wonderful run of serials they did together. This came out, of course, in the golden year of Hollywood in 1939, so that just proves that even in the golden year of Hollywood, the film serial was at its relative peak. So Daredevils of the Red Circle is one of the great films of the golden year of Hollywood. It doesn't get mentioned very often, but see any number of serials and then see some of the Witney-English serials, and especially this one, Daredevils of the Red Circle, and you'll recognize just how much it is a cut above the typical serial, and it's even, arguably one of the best, not just of the Witney-English serials, but one of the best serials ever made. It's debated among fans what is the best serial, what represents the best of film serials, and generally it's the same few sort of bandied about, and the vast majority of them are from the Witney-English collaboration. It really is the key directing partnership of the film serial, and both would go on to other things as a solo director. Witney himself directed a number of serials on his own, and they're also excellent as well. But it's just something about the partnership between the two that resulted, and along with their producers at Republic at this particular time, it's where every single aspect seems to have lined up perfectly to produce really the best run of film serials ever done, and it resulted in, I think, one of the best canons or bodies of work in any film genre. So this is literally where I think the action film really spread its wings and took flight, because William Witney does not get the credit he deserves. He really was the director who revolutionized the fight sequence. He was the first person to realize that to make action better and more realistic, and how you improve the staging of a fight sequence, is to break it up into multiple shots. He was apparently inspired by, he was actually apparently friends with Busby Berkeley, and went on the set one day when Berkeley was shooting one of his masterpiece dance sequences, and was mesmerized at how he was putting these things together, and then started to try and apply some of those same techniques to fight and action sequences. And that's why in the William Witney directed or co-directed serials, without even seeing the credits, you will know if you see the trailer for one of the Witney-English serials that it's one of theirs, simply due to the sheer dynamism, I guess. The action is without equal, and he still is one of, if not the greatest action director of all time, without parallel, without his pioneering work in moving the action sequence forward from just guys in a room and having fisticuffs, and not breaking it up and using the camera and making the camera part of the experience. It's very possible it would have taken much longer for fight sequences to develop further than how they began. So Whitney's contribution to action cinema cannot be understated. And it's painful that nobody's ever heard of him because, unfortunately, serials are such a niche thing these days. So this is a perfect example of a serial you can start with. Don't do what I did and what most of us probably did and start with a lesser serial. I know the first ones I ever saw were the Columbia Batman ones. And to compare one of those or any Columbia serial to a Republic serial, specifically a Witney-English serial, is... to say that it takes the scales away from your eyes does not even begin to describe the difference in intensity and just the dynamic thrills of one of these. And again, Daredevils of the Red Circle is often discussed as being perhaps the greatest serial, not just that Republic produced, but the greatest serial of all time. That is definitely possible. I've not seen every serial ever made. Unfortunately, there are so many, and unfortunately, they are in usually terrible shape or lost or unavailable, which is just criminal. But of the 15 some odd serials I've seen, this is already definitely in my top 5, which is pretty much dominated by Witney-English serials. The only one that isn't one of theirs is the original Flash Gordon serial, which is another of the iconic serials. But it's a sort of different formulation where the story is allowed to take a bit more precedence over the intensity of the action. It still has action, don't get me wrong, but you will notice a difference between the studios who produce serials, such as comparing a Universal serial to a Republic serial, and specifically the Witney-English serials above all. And each studio had their own formulation. Now, of course, the Cliffhanger Adventure serial usually has the introduction chapter, which is usually a little bit longer, sets up the story, and builds to a really impressive cliffhanger, which then you have to come back to your theater in the next week to see chapter 2, and that would start the slightly shorter but more set time links. This especially goes for Republic. Republic would have a chapter 1 that was usually about 20 to 30 minutes, and then the other chapters would be more like 15 to 20 minutes. They'd all be about the same length. And this developed over time. So if you look at the history of serials at, say, for example, Republic, they were sort of felt around once they started making serials and tried to figure out what they were doing, and then they settled on the 12 chapter length. Later on they would try other lengths like 15 chapters or so, but the 12 chapter length is I think the best sort of sweet spot of telling a longer story without it getting dragged on too long. And they came up with their own particular ways of doing this. So there at Republic, the introductions for each of the chapters would not just be a recap. They actually have the wonderful text caption cards with the various character headshots that would start each chapter with a lovely little piece of music, and they would have a little text caption at the bottom recapping what had happened leading up to that point. And then you get a little bit of footage of the climax of the previous episode, and then it would throw you into the resolution of the cliffhanger. Then, of course, the chapter would build to another cliffhanger to get you to come back. And then they also hit upon the idea and started doing this, and it became a sort of standard of Republic serials, of having a recap chapter. Usually the penultimate chapter, here, chapter 11, where you have a little bit of business, and then one of the characters starts spouting off events from the past chapters, and then you get basically a replay. So this is essentially where the sort of episode recap idea came from, and then became ingrained eventually in television, and that's where most people know it from. But if you ever wondered where the sort of idea of recapping a series came from, it actually came from the serials, and especially at Republic at this time. So this serial is no exception. We have the iconic opening Republic headshot text caption stills for the different characters recapping the chapter before, and then we also have the recap chapter as the penultimate, chapter 11. So obviously when you watch that particular chapter, you're only going to get a little bit of new information because it's basically just set up to recap the previous 10 chapters. Now, it goes without saying the serials were not designed to be watched front to back, start to finish, all 12 chapters in a row, because it's going to get very repetitive if you do that, especially with the recaps and the text screens and the credits for each episode. So it is best to watch a film serial or in bursts. I usually do 1 to 2 chapters at a time, That seems to be the best, because sometimes you get to cheat a little. Sometimes the cliffhangers are so good that you have to know how they resolved it, so you can do 2 chapters at a time. But if you do any more than that, or if you watch like 5 or 6 in a row, it's going to get very old, and that usually, I think, makes serials have a sort of they get a bad rap, because people will watch a big chunk of them and not follow more of the form of, you're supposed to watch these in separate pieces. So for anyone who's never watched a classic serial, it's best to enjoy it in bursts, to watch one a night or spread it out over a week or 2 weeks or something. But if you spread it out way too much, you're probably going to forget things. But then, of course, that's why they had the recaps in the first place. Another thing about serials is the cliffhangers and the resolutions. Some of the fun of watching classic serials is wondering how they're going to resolve it, and sometimes you could tell the writers couldn't figure something out, or they didn't have enough time, and that's where the notion of cheating on the resolutions comes from, where all of a sudden, in the resolution of the next chapter, you have something introduced that was not there before, a shot of the heroes escaping, or all of a sudden there's some life-saving device that they're able to use and get out of the scenario they're in, and it's definitely cheating a little bit. But for the most part, those are actually quite endearing, because sometimes there seems literally like there's zero chance that they survive the cliffhanger, because some of these are cut so tightly and there's nothing visible. So there will always be a little degree of the resolution as something you didn't see before. That doesn't really happen all that much in this serial. There are 1 or 2 bits where there definitely is a little degree of that, because they had to do something, because there was no way they could get them out. And this serial has some of the iconic cliffhangers, and the editing of them is unbelievably good. The sense of peril and suspense that is built to by the end of some of these chapters, right when you get to the cliffhanger, and then it immediately cuts to a hard fade out with this booming music cue by William Lava, who did the music for this and a lot of the Republic serials, and then right into the amazing end credits theme he came up with, which is a variation on the opening credits theme. That is why you watch serials. This is one of the magic ones, that when you get to the end cliffhanger and it builds to that intensity, and then it goes into the rousing end credits music, it makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up a little bit. That's what these are supposed to do. And of course, this was the inspiration for Spielberg and Lucas making the Indiana Jones trilogy. And when you hear them talk about, oh, we tried to make it like a Republic serial, this is what they were referencing. And when you go and see the best of Republic, it all makes sense, because Republic made 66 serials, I believe is the number overall, and they kept making them when the serials were going out of fashion and they had lower budgets and things. But you want to see serials from the golden age, and especially from the Witney-English collaboration, and this is one of the best that they ever produced. So when serial fans say that this is quite possibly the best serial ever made, they're not kidding. To talk about the plot, what makes Daredevils special is it's not dealing with a superheroic character. Some serials actually had superheroes and were comic adaptations. Witney-English made another of the greatest serials of all time in The Adventures of Captain Marvel, which is the first comic book adaptation to screen, and still one of the best ones, I'd argue, even though it definitely takes some liberties with the source material. But it is dealing with essentially 3 normal people, and so that means the stakes are always raised, because they're not superheroes, they're not vigilantes, they are normal people in impossible situations. They do have some abilities normal people don't have, because they're actually a team who work in a circus. One is a strongman, one is an acrobat, and one is an escape artist, essentially. So they're able to use talents they developed and honed in the circus to try and defeat the villain. The plot of Daredevils of the Red Circle is really interesting, because it is far more complex and intricate than the typical serial setup. So the setup of Daredevils is the notorious villain who escapes from prison is so unhinged that he refuses to be called or referred to by anything other than his prison number, 39013. and he is played by the immortal screen legend Charles Middleton, one of the great screen villains of all time. It was simply because he played Ming the Merciless in the Flash Gordon serial trilogy and many, many other films. So he brings that gravitas he always had. But it's not just a simple plot of revenge. He's out to get his former employer, Granville, played by Miles Mallerson. And the gag is he has actually already kidnapped Granville and taken his place with an intricate bit of makeup tomfoolery, and keeps Granville imprisoned in his own house in a secret basement area in a prison cell. And he's got it rigged up to where he has a poison gas canister mechanism in there, and he has to come down there several times a day to refill it with water. Otherwise, the torture device will roll the gas canister down, it will explode and kill Granville. All the while, he is going on a citywide rampage, destroying all of the industry plants and things, and literally the whole town that Granville had built and installed. And it's a part of his plot of revenge, which is simply due to his unhinged nature. But we're led into all of this in Chapter 1, in the beginning. So we're given the villain's plot and the setup, which starts the suspense timer going. And every time the events are related to Granville in terms of how they are trying to stop 39013, we know they're just giving the villain more information to then use to further destroy the town. So this is one of the serials where we're let into the whole secret and the villain plot at the beginning, which gets us further invested in how all of this will finally be exposed and what will happen in the denouement. And that, again, sets the suspense clock going in terms of that ticking clock sort of feeling. And it makes us more invested because there's a little bit of inherent humor of seeing the villain playing the sort of the quote-unquote good character, that sort of thing where you have an actor technically playing three roles. And Miles Mander is really good in this because he's basically playing a dual role. And the effects work is really interesting and extremely well done when you have him on the screen as the two different doubles and you don't really see any join lines or anything. Then there's the really great moment of every time he takes the makeup off, and then all of a sudden it's Charles Middleton there, and it looks so seamless that you can't really tell where the camera cut or anything. And then he gets to essentially goad Granville further. The heroes of our story, the trio from the circus, become involved because 39013 uses their act to set fire to and destroy the entire circus, and in the process to show that there are real stakes to the story and how they get invested in destroying 39013. The kid brother of the lead circus performer actually is injured in the fire, with which they barely escape with their lives, and then dies in the hospital, which is that shows you this is definitely going to be a more gripping serial, because it's usually that you sometimes had a kid sidekick in a serial or as a side character. They didn't just kill little kids in serials, so it really sets the stakes immediately, and it gives 100% of the reason why these characters then devote their life to the destruction of 39013 to stop him at all costs. So they go and start working for Granville, who they think is leading the charge against 39013, not realizing that he is actually 39013. The trio is played by an interesting mix. You have the actor Charles Quigley, then you have the legendary stuntman Dave Sharp actually playing one of the lead roles for the first time, which amusingly meant that, being one of the greatest stuntmen in history, he had to be doubled for some sequences because they couldn't risk him getting injured, because then they'd have to shoot around him, and being one of the leads, they couldn't do that. And then most interestingly, we have Herman Brix as the third, playing the strongman. And this, of course, to any classic film fan, is obviously Bruce Bennett before he changed his name. He had really started out playing a really great version of Tarzan, much closer to the Edgar Rice Burroughs original creation in the novels. But that kind of got him stuck in doing serials because originally he was supposed to play Tarzan in the MGM films, but was injured and lost the role to Johnny Weissmuller. Then played Tarzan in rival productions and serials. And he wound up doing a number of films and serials at Republic and other studios. And this was the point at which it was really just before he would change his name and sort of try and rebrand himself as Bruce Bennett, the actor, trying to make people forget that he had been Tarzan and trying to get more serious roles. And he would go on to a rather nice career. But it's interesting seeing him here in a serial as part of the trio. And again, this is where we have a trio of heroes. It's not just one central character like you get in most serials. So that's another distinction. So not only is it 3 characters instead of 1, but they're also completely normal people with a real motivation for throwing themselves into trying to stop the villain. It's not just a government agent trying to stop a villain with a doomsday plot, or a superhero or vigilante character trying to stop an evil villain with a death ray or something. Although there is a sort of death ray as one of the cliffhanger chapters in this serial. So, I mean, what's not to love about death rays in serials? So that sets up the plot for the remaining, really for the whole 12-chapter serial. It's very simple in terms of how they get going, but it's the way the story is laid out. And since we're literally invited into the villain's machinations at the beginning, that again it really starts to build the suspense from chapter 1. And the great thing about the Republic serials, especially because we get more story development in chapter 1 to get the serial going, it gets us more invested. And that is maintained by the fact that our 3 lead characters are themselves normal people. They don't have superpowers. They don't do this for a living. And so that adds an extra layer of intensity to all the fight scenes and the cliffhangers, because they are really going at it tooth and nail. There's a great sense of realism because this serial, as a lot of Republic serials at the time, I was able to use a lot of real locations. So when 39013 is going to be attacking some sort of industry plant, they literally could go to a plant and there's guys running around the catwalks and they're climbing ladders and guys are jumping everywhere and they're having endless fist fights, and then they start shooting guns in an oil refinery and there's flames, and you have to wonder how they managed to pull this off in a refinery, but they really go for it. And of course, the other great charm of serials is everything you see is done for real by real people, because this far predates digital technology, and any of the effects work was done by the great Lydecker brothers, who did all the effects work at Republic, pioneered a lot of effects techniques. And so you'll get some of their incredible model work, explosions, and then some matte paintings, and obviously some optical shots here and there. And they're always really well done. They were really chief in their field, even though they were working at Republic, which is not seen as a major studio. But it is the intensity of the action and the energy of the direction of the Witney-English team that really carries this serial and makes it truly special. And the cliffhangers are all uniformly excellent. They build to such an intensity. They are some of the best cliffhangers in the classic serial form. Again, 1 or 2 of the resolutions are obviously a little coincidental, but that's what you're going to run into with any serial, especially with some of these where the death traps are so seemingly inescapable that you can't even figure out how they got out of it. The chapter 1 is pretty iconic, where they're previewing the new underground traffic tunnel, and 39013 has secretly been using an oil platform to drill a big hole in the top so they can flood it. And of course, right as our hero is going through on a motorcycle by himself, and you start to notice the crack and the water starts to come through, and then he has to basically go hell for leather as the wall of water is following him. And it's like, well, how the hell is he gonna, how are they gonna get out of this? And you think they can't top that, and then all of a sudden they're falling into a watery pit at the refinery that all of a sudden gets lit on fire on top as they fall into it. And then you think, well, they can't get out of that, but they do, and they keep building the intensity of the cliffhangers, even if they aren't always as spectacular as some of the opening ones. And again, that really is assisted by the amazing editing, particularly at the end of each chapter when they build to those death trap sequences. It's some of the best editing I've seen in a serial, which is really a lost art form to edit the literal hell out of a sequence to really sell the peril that these guys are in. And again, because they are normal guys, that only adds to the intensity factor. It would be different if it was Batman in a death trap, even though the Batman Columbia serials are nowhere near the quality of this. So our heroic trio go through many different set pieces and fight sequences and all kinds of peril to try and finally unmask and discover 39 out of 13 and stop his evil plans. But they are assisted throughout by a mysterious figure cloaked in black who leaves them little hints on a card with a red circle in it. So that's part of where the title comes into play, and it's based on their circus act. There usually is a sort of mysterious character in a lot of serials, and there also is a degree of what you get in other serials of trying to guess who the villain is. Of course, they don't know that 39 or 13 is hiding among them, but they start realizing that someone must be informing on their whereabouts, because it's like the villain magically knows where they're going to strike, where they're going to go next. Their other assistant is, because you just have to have a dog in here somewhere, is their dog, beautifully named Tuffy, who actually does help out in some of the chapters and in one of the best flourishes I've ever seen. In the chapters where Tuffy plays an important role, he gets his own title card with a headshot at the recap, which is just, sometimes people ask me, oh, well, what do you think is missing in movies? And I'm like, that's it. Tuffy the dog getting his own recap card at the start of the chapter. So I'd forgotten about that. It's a beautiful flourish. The one thing about seeing this serial today, as most anything from the golden age of Hollywood, there are some dated aspects. It's 1939 after all, but unfortunately there is a comic relief character played by Fred Toombs under his sort of nom de plume on stage as Snowflake, and he's literally called, that's his name in the serial. He is the butler in the Granville Mansion, and he appears in a few chapters and is obviously there for the sort of stereotypical comic relief of coming in with the dinner tray and something happening, and then obviously drops said tray. It's nothing particularly bad, but it is obviously a cultural stereotype that was very common at the time. He's not in every chapter, and I will say he actually does get to help out every once in a while, and particularly one of the death traps where they're trapped in a garage and it's being filled with poison gas and carbon monoxide. He is there and sort of helps them get out of it a little bit. So he does have some participation in terms of the character. So it's not just 100% comic relief, but it is pretty much just that. And that will be off-putting to some viewers today. Obviously, it is a dated cultural stereotype, but it's not, not horrible or the worst thing in the world. There are far worse examples of this in many other classic films, even from the same year. Unfortunately, it was a different time where this stuff was pretty commonplace. But it is something to note. You will run into that. So if you see this serial today, it is going to be one of the serials where there is that aspect in there. It's, again, not horrible. It doesn't wreck the experience of the serial, and he's only in certain select chapters, but it is obviously a product of its era, and that was not seen as it really as much of a negative as it is today. It was just something that was unfortunately commonplace at the time. So it is important to mention that for those who haven't seen this serial, but for those who have, you'll know what I mean, in that it's a minor character that only appears in certain chapters, and it's just a unfortunate stereotype of the time. It's not necessarily a terrible thing that makes you not enjoy the rest of the serial, but that is the one very dated aspect of this serial. We also get the cast peppered with many of, I should say, many sort of serial buff standouts. In particular, my personal favorite is the actor C. Montague Shaw, who really adds a great sense of gravitas and just a sense of civility to all the characters he played, especially in serials. I really loved his performance in Undersea Kingdom, where he has that sort of dual role where he's the friendly scientist who is essentially brainwashed into working for the villain and then becomes an out-and-out villainous character under that influence. So there's always a lot of that fun stuff of the of an actor getting to play a sort of dual or triple role in serials, and so I love seeing him pop up in other serials, even if, as in here, it's a more minor secondary role. So I won't spoil the story for those who haven't seen it, because this is one of the serials that everyone should see. It is one of the greatest film serials ever made, and it stands as still, to this day, one of the greatest action films ever made. All of the Witney-English serials are among the greatest action films ever made, as are, I would also argue, at least the ones I've seen, the serials that and some of the films that William Witney did in his solo career. But in particular, this sort of magic time period for Republic serials in the late 1930s, early 40s, especially with the core team of William Witney and John English, they rank as some of the most magical films ever made. They are timeless, and they are breathtaking in their action. Witney and English, again, also made the masterpiece serial Adventures of Captain Marvel, which is another of the greatest serials ever made. They also made, again, another masterpiece and another of the greatest serials ever made in Zorro's Fighting Legion, which is where the iconic Yakima Canutt first did the Stagecoach sequence that was repeated in Stagecoach and then famously lifted for Raiders of the Lost Ark, of doing the transfer and going under the whole team of horses and coming out the back of the stagecoach. But there, since it's all done in one, it is him going under a full team of horses, coming out the back of the stagecoach, bouncing up and down, and then essentially grabbing on one-handed to the back and being flapped around like a rag doll. And when you see that for the first time, it is... You can't breathe. It's just totally, it takes your breath away. That's what the action is like in all the Witney-English serials. And again, here in Daredevils, it is magnified because these are essentially normal guys. And so when they get into these perilous situations, they really have to go tooth and nail, and you feel that intensity, which is, of course, dramatically personified and enhanced by the incredible techniques that William Witney developed, who really is the father of the modern action sequence. I mean, when you see these serials, this is where everything starts. It is incalculable. To try and determine his contribution to action cinema is incalculable. I mean, it's really the sort of foundational building block that the sort of comparison I think you could make is comparing narrative cinema with comparing it to Griffith's influence on narrative cinema. It is that level of influence. So that is why he still belongs at really the top of the heap of greatest action directors of all time. And, unfortunately, nobody knows this stuff anymore because serials have become such a niche, which is why the Kino Lorber Blu-ray, now that I'm finally getting to talking about the disc itself, is so important. Even though it is out of print, you can still find it used or on some different resellers, and it may very well be the best video release of a serial I've ever seen and that has ever existed. So the cover has nice original art. It's a standard single disc release, and this came out back in 2017. Unfortunately, they say that their sales of this and Captain Marvel, which are the serials they've done, they weren't so high, so they're acting like they're not going to be doing anymore, which is really unfortunate. Paramount has the Republic catalog, so they can do new scans like they did for this, and this is credited as a brand new 4K scan. It looks astonishing. If you've ever seen what serials have looked like over the years on VHS and DVD, and especially when you see them in awful shape on YouTube or random public domain uploads because the rights and quality is all over the place, this is revelatory. I have never seen a serial with this level of quality. It has not been, in terms of the picture quality, it has not been fully restored frame by frame. So when you see 4K scan, you think, oh, it's a 4K remaster. Well, not necessarily. So when you watch this, you are going to get all kinds of baked-in defects. There are some bits of speckles. There is an occasional scratch or two. There is a little bit of frame wobble scattered throughout. So it's a beautiful new scan, but don't think that this is a fully restored release. It's also, serial. It's much longer in runtime, so it's a lot more work than a standard 90-minute feature, even though it is still, Academy ratio and black and white mono sound. That is how I think they got it onto one disc. You can do that and keep the bitrate and encoding pretty nice, but I would have preferred to have had 2 discs to really maximize that. It's still pretty common to get serials entirely on 1 disc. It was like that a lot on DVD, but a lot of those became 2 DVD sets once the format got better. Most VHS releases were 2 VHS tapes, and most Laserdisc releases were 2 LDs. So I do wish that they had used 2 discs for a better bit rate, but also I can understand they had to do this with their normal sort of budget. And the bitrate and encoding is still fine, which is, again, it takes some doing to get a whole serial, all 12 chapters, onto a single disc, which it is helped by the fact that it is, again, Academy black and white mono sound. So the picture quality is astonishing on this in terms of how this has looked before. Essentially, this had a official release by Republic on VHS tape, and that's about it. I don't think this got LD, and I don't think this got DVD either. Not all Republic serials did, so most of their classic serial library is still, unfortunately, VHS exclusive for the official transfers from the studio. Again, Republic is now under Paramount, so these would all be done by Paramount, and if somebody could convince them to scan the important Republic titles and to preserve the legacy of the Republic serials, we could get more releases. There's no reason why we shouldn't. It's just the fact that it's not seen to have a market. And I think if these were marketed better and people were made to understand why these are so important, and if they could then try one like this, one of the masterpieces, and get into the spirit of the thing, realize this influenced everybody, and particularly for Star Wars and Indiana Jones, then they'd have a handle on it. You'd be able to translate the appeal of the serial to a modern audience and sell more discs to make it viable. So again, the picture quality is not perfect. It does have some of the quirks of a lot of serials on video. If you look closely at the opening character captions that with the text and the headshots, it does seem like the top is a little cropped off on some, especially you'll see the sort of, it's like it cuts part of their forehead off. That's a minor thing, but I did notice that watching through all the chapters. Another thing that happens is a lot of times with serials, the credits get standardized. Usually the first chapter has a little shot of each cast member with their credit, and then all the others just have a single bit of text for a much shorter, more standardized credit sequence. But if you look closely at the MPAA number on a lot of releases, you'll notice it'll be the same credits used over and over, so they didn't have to restore another one. Sometimes that causes problems. Sometimes they're just repeating it. Thankfully, that doesn't really seem to apply here. I think they may have reused the end credits for each one in terms of the restoration and scan. But most of them do have different MPAA numbers. I think 1 or 2 repeat, but I could be wrong. So, again, really the only issue there is I think some of the character caption headshots are a little cropped on the top. And again, this isn't a fully restored thing, so you are going to notice the occasional shot that's a bit softer, some bits where they had to do to reconstruct some of the chapters, but by and large, even with the built-in damage and scratches and the occasion, there are 1 or 2 cue marks as well. It does add to the experience. It makes you feel like you're watching a direct transfer, which is pretty much what this is. It's a direct 4K transfer of original negatives of one of Republic's masterpiece serials in quality that may have not even been there on the original theatrical release, because those chapters would have been run to death. And it is breathtaking seeing a serial like this because most are in dire shape even on the official releases. So hearing that Kino and others are not interested in doing more serials is heartbreaking because this is majestic. even though it's not perfect, and I wish it was 2 discs, and I wish it had been fully restored. I can understand why they didn't do that because it's so much runtime. The disc itself is just a standard Kino disc. Now, to talk about the audio, we have DTS HDMA mono lossless, which is pretty typical for Kino. The track itself for all the chapters sounds great. There is natural hiss there. You are going to get the occasional tick and pop. So, like the picture, it hasn't been fully restored 100%, but that also means it hasn't been hit with seemingly heavy amounts of noise reduction and overprocess. So, this is very much like an archival transfer because it is pretty much just a direct scan, slightly cleaned up and presented on disc as is. And that does fit with sort of the charm of a serial. So it does, it plays beautifully. And again, if you've ever seen what even this serial looked like before on VHS, or when you see the terrible YouTube uploads, this is just, this will literally blow your mind. So it's a shame it's out of print. You've got to go and find this somewhere. I will link in the description below some of the places I found it popping up, but it is starting to creep up in price on the used market, unfortunately. Now, talking about the overall presentation and the extras, I will say the menu is unfortunately a bit generic, and when you start it up, it's just a title screen, and then it has a little box to select your chapters, but it doesn't give the titles. It just has a number, and then it has a little tiny random picture image from the chapters. So it's very difficult to tell which chapter is which if you don't have the serial memorized, and especially if you're like me and you come back to it every once in a while and watch another chapter or two, you have to then try and remember where you left off. So it's very difficult to keep that straight. So I wish that it at least had the chapter titles, but it's a minor quibble. You can figure out where you are, but it does take some doing simply due to the simplicity of the menu. Now, we do get some trailers, so there's a little trailer gallery that does advertise Kino's other release of Adventures of Captain Marvel on Blu-ray, which is another must-own masterpiece serial. But we get selected audio commentary by Michael Schlesinger. He talks on 4 of the chapters. I believe it's 1, 4, 9, and 11, I believe. And it's a pretty nice little commentary. It's very rare. The idea of a serial having a commentary is just an amazing notion, because there's so much to talk about, so many of the performers and actors and writers and directors and Republic in general, and the serial form and all the legacy of the serials. But of course, somebody doing a commentary on all 12 chapters would be a mammoth task, so it's understandable why they only pop up for certain ones. And it's a good listen. He goes through a lot of the historical background, talks about the various performers and Witney-English and Republic, and it's a nice listen that does enhance your viewing experience with the serial, but again, it's only on 4 select chapters. So that is Kino Lorber's Blu-ray release of Daredevils of the Red Circle from 1939, directed by William Witney and John English. This is, without question, one of the finest chapter serials ever made. It is literally, it defines the form. It is the pinnacle of the film serial, and when some people make the claim that this is the best serial ever made, I can completely understand why. It is one of the greatest, and I hesitate to say which particular one I think is the greatest because I've only seen about 15 so far. So I haven't seen every serial ever made, but in my own personal ranking of the ones I've seen, this is definitely right up there in the absolute top 5, which again, pretty much 4 of them are Witney-English serials anyway. It is one of the finest action films ever made. Again, I think you should apply that credit to all of the Witney-English serials, which really redefined action forever. I mean, there is literally a before and after the what Witney brought to the whole notion of doing action in film and how you stage it and how you really make the camera a participant and use editing to really make action move. Before this point, no one really did that. And then afterwards, it kind of became commonplace and no one really realized where these innovations came from. It came from the Witney-English serials primarily. So this is a must-own, astonishing release. And again, I think quality-wise, This is the best single release of a film serial that has ever existed. There are no technical problems. There are no issues with in terms of it having weird edits. There's no major problems with the titles, as a lot of serials have, and the quality is mind-blowing when you, especially when you're like me and you've seen a number of other serials and you've seen how badly they are treated. And again, a lot of them, especially the Republic ones, are still stuck as VHS exclusive in terms of what came from the actual studio. So I really hope Paramount steps up and actually starts restoring and scanning more of the classic Republic serial library. I think it's criminal there isn't a Republic serial collection on Blu-ray like they did on VHS and Laserdisc, and even some on DVD. These should be available for people to understand the history and development of the cinema, and the serial has been a long neglected and overlooked genre. Yes, it is an older form of entertainment, but that does not mean it doesn't have historical significance. And this being the pinnacle of the serial is really a perfect place to start if you've never seen one. Especially when you see one for the first time, you want to see one of the great ones. Don't do what I did and watch one of the lesser ones first, and that sort of turned me off on serials for a number of years. This is one of the best serials and one of the best action films ever made. It's a shame it's out of print. Get a copy wherever you can. Again, I will link in the description below some of the places where I found it. It is getting up there in price, but it is worth every single cent. You will be able to come back to this and rewatch it for really the rest of your life. It will become a treasured part of any action fan's library. It is one of the masterpieces from the golden year of Hollywood, 1939, and just an absolute timeless, amazing marvel that can still make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Like even right now, I'm thinking of the amazing end credits theme for Daredevils of the Red Circle. So that is my review of Kino's disc. Again, it's a shame they're not doing more serials. I know these don't. They claim they didn't sell very well, but I think if these were better marketed and more people were made aware of how amazing these are and how much they influence things that people love and take for granted today, I think they would sell better if more people could get experience with serials and get into the form of it and enjoy the sort of going back to the past experience of watching a serial spread out over a week or two. It's a magical thing to do if you've never done it in your home theater, you're watching at home. It's so much fun to watch a masterful serial like this and spread it out over time and really get the feel of being a little kid in the theater in 1939 and waiting with bated breath for the next chapter to see how the heroes were possibly going to get out of the hellish scenario they found themselves in. And then you spend the whole next day trying to figure out, well, how are they going to get out of it? And you can't come up with anything. And then when you get to the next chapter, it's something you just didn't think of at all, and then builds to yet another one to hook you into the next chapter. So I cannot stress the importance of this release enough. And to be quite honest, this is one of the finest discs that Kino has ever released, which is saying something because they've done thousands of titles. It is beautiful across the board, and again, I think technically it's the best release of a serial I've ever seen. So I would possibly say this is the most important Kino title ever. And I really mean that in terms of how much serials have been bashed about over the years. This is one of the masterpiece serials from the Witney-English team. It's one of Republic's finest serials from the most famous studio for film serials. Its influence is legendary. You mentioned this, and it is, said with reverence and all, for all serial fans. They know what you're talking about when you're talking about Daredevils of the Red Circle. But again, simply for the importance of this and how serials have been so badly treated, and it's a beautiful 4K scan with an actual commentary extra that's really good. Again, this may very well be, I think, the finest or most important Kino disc that they have ever done. And there are no major technical problems, which also really helps because they do so many things that unfortunately not all of them are perfect, or a lot are based on older masters that are really showing their age. This rectifies so many problems, and if only we could get more serials in quality like this on Blu-ray releases that are affordable, it would be truly something. There is a market for serials, and by purchasing official releases, it shows that you support restoring parts of cinematic history that have been really overshadowed and overlooked and have been lost to time. So before that happens completely, We really need to see more classic serials hitting disc, and that's another reason why I think this is quite possibly the most important title and most important release that Kino has ever done. So that's my review of Kino Lorber's 2017 Blu-ray of Daredevils of the Red Circle. It is unfortunately out of print, but I cannot encourage you highly enough to seek out a copy. Even if you have to pay over the original list price, even at $30 or $40, it is beyond worth it. It is the finest quality release of a film serial I have ever seen. And the serial itself is magic. I mean, it still makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up just thinking about it, and that incredible music and the intensity of the action. And it is one of the greatest action films ever made. So I hope this has been fun and at least somewhat informative. I know serials are a niche thing, but for those who have never experienced the true magic of getting invested in a cliffhanger serial, this would be a perfect place to start. Any of the Witney-English serials would be, but this one especially is one of the finest examples of the form of the lost art of the film serial. So as always, I would like to say, keep supporting boutique labels and studio labels by buying films on disc. Keep spinning your disc to help keep physical media alive. And thanks ever so much for watching.